Good morning, class. This is the ECON 353 Macroeconomics class. Today is April 19th, Tuesday.
The class will finish up chapter 13 of the textbook. Here is the order of video clips we are going to consider today. 1. Phillips Curve, the definitions and historical record. 2. Expectations and the Phillips Curve. 3. Hot topic about the roller coaster ride over the long run of the economy. 4. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the long run equilibrium. 5. Economic animation about the crowding out and lags. 6. Macroeconomic problems. 7. The Phillips Curve. Here is the first video clip.
We're going to now discuss the relationship between the Phillips curve that we developed in the previous discussion and the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that we've built to describe the macroeconomy. We're going to see as we look at our aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram that it doesn't quite match the Phillips curve. That is, instead of measuring inflation and unemployment, it measures the price level and the amount of output. However, the amount of output in the economy is related to the unemployment rate. The green line in the diagram represents the speed limit of the economy. The long-run aggregate supply tells us how much that we can produce if all resources are employed. And if we try to produce more, that means pushing unemployment below the natural rate. The green line is associated with the natural rate of unemployment, and increases in output mean unemployment is falling as we recruit more workers to produce more output. Although we won't see inflation in the economy, we will see the price level rising in this picture. The price level goes up whenever the economy tries to run faster than the speed limit. Let's do an analysis using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves, and then show how that translates into a movement along a Phillips curve. In the process, we'll see what different expectations make for the Phillips curve in the short run and in the long run. So let's start with an example. Suppose the government decides to increase spending by building a satellite or a new system of roads. The aggregate demand curve shifts outwards as this government spending is added to the other demand in the economy to give us a larger total aggregate demand. At the original price level now, we have excess aggregate demand in the economy as people are trying to buy more than businesses are producing. This excess aggregate demand pushes up the aggregate price level. As the aggregate price level rises, we get adjustment on both sides of the market. On the demand side, higher prices shrink consumer wealth and lead to less consumer spending. Higher prices increase the demand for money, raising interest rates and reducing business spending. And also, higher prices deter foreign spending on the goods from our economy. So aggregate demand decreases. On the supply side, higher prices lead to an increase in output as businesses face sticky wages, sticky prices, and confusion about whether there's general inflation or an improvement in their own profit opportunities. This leads us to a new equilibrium point with an output level, Y1, that's greater than full employment, and a price level, P1, that's greater than the original price level of P0. So notice what you have in this picture, an increase in output correlated with an increase in the price level. That is, more output being produced, which means more workers are employed, and the unemployment rate is falling. It's falling below the natural rate associated with our speed limit or full employment to some rate that's lower than that. More workers being hired in order to produce more output. Now, we don't see an increase in inflation here, but we do see a rising price level. And if we tried to stay faster than the speed limit, over time the price level would just keep rising, and it would be rising at a higher rate the further past the speed limit we tried to drive the economy. So you can see in this picture that as long as we're moving along the short-run aggregate supply curve, there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and the price level. The more output you try to produce, the lower the unemployment rate falls, the higher the price level is going to go. Now that's the short run. In the long run, however, people are going to start to adjust to this higher price level and the higher inflation rate. When they begin to adjust to it, they factor this new inflation rate into their behavior, and the underlying rate of inflation in the economy begins to rise. What happens then is people figure out that we're in an inflationary economy, one that's trying to drive faster than the speed limit. Wages become unstuck, and laborers ask for bigger cost of living adjustments. Prices become unstuck, and businesses raise their prices along with their costs. And finally, people figure out that they're in an inflationary environment, not one that's creating opportunities for their own particular business. When all this happens, we find that everyone begins to push these costs onto their customers by raising the prices they charge for their goods and services. And what ends up happening in the long run is we reach a new short-run aggregate supply curve where the price level is higher, but we've moved all the way back to the full employment level of output. That is, in the long run, we've got to observe the speed limit. In the long run, the price level goes higher, but output goes right back to where it was before. In the short run, there's a trade-off. You can get more output if you're willing to tolerate higher prices. But in the long run, as people pass the prices on, the costs on, as people adjust to the inflationary environment, we are restored to full employment. Even though the price level goes up, there's no increase in output, there's no reduction in unemployment. There's no trade-off in the long run. The only question is, how long does it take us to get to the long run? How long does the short run and the possibility of a trade-off last? Well, that depends. If expectations are adaptive or backward-looking, then we could stay down here along this curve for a relatively long time. This curve would gradually and slowly ratchet up as people see that, well, inflation occurred last year, it's probably going to occur this year too. Getting used to last year's inflation, influencing this year's perception of inflation, influencing next year's. As long as people are looking at what's happened in the past, the rate of adjustment is going to be relatively slow. But if people are forward-looking and have rational expectations, then what happens is the short-run aggregate supply curve moves immediately. People see, look, prices are going to keep adjusting till we get to P infinity. Therefore, everybody goes ahead and raises their prices right now, and we move immediately to the new long-run point. There is no period of trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So a Phillips curve depends on people not having completely, totally rational expectations. That is, if wages and prices are free to adjust immediately and people see where we are in this picture, then we're going to go ding right to this point without any trade-off. On the other hand, if people are able to be fooled, if there are rigidities in the economy from contracts, then you can have the persistence of lower unemployment and higher inflation in the short run. There's a trade-off along the blue curve. Let's now translate this story into a Phillips curve. Here we have a diagram with the inflation rate on the vertical axis and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. And I'm going to go ahead and put in our green line, which represents full employment. Here's the unemployment rate that's associated with full employment output. Maybe it's 5%. If you want, in the short run, to have more output and lower unemployment, you've got to tolerate higher prices. If you're willing to tolerate more unemployment and lower output, you can get lower prices or less inflation. However, this only works in the short run, because in the long run, people will get used to this higher rate of inflation. Therefore, they'll change their behavior and go back and supply only the amount of labor that they were supplying before as prices rise to make those new higher wages less interesting. So what happens then in the long run is the Phillips curve shifts up to reflect the new underlying rate of inflation. If you've driven the economy faster than the speed limit, the Phillips curve is going to be shifting up. Now, what's happened in the United States in recent years is that increases in productivity have caused labor costs to rise relatively slowly. This slow increase in labor costs has then put a damper on inflation, and people are now in our economy used to inflation rates of around 2% a year. Therefore, the underlying inflation rate in our economy is relatively low, which means we're able to get a lot of output without a big increase in prices, because contracts, cost of living adjustments, and people's expectations have fixed on an idea that inflation is going to be at a relatively low rate. When the underlying rate of inflation is low because people expect it, then you get a more favorable trade-off in the short run. However, the more expectations become rational, the less likely we are to have any trade-off in the short run at all. The curve just moves up and down along the green line. If expectations are perfectly rational and people are never fooled and wages and prices aren't sticky, there is no Phillips curve. The long-run Phillips curve is vertical, and we're going to be on this curve as long as we are as long as everyone is rational, forward-looking, and is not constrained by fixed wages or fixed prices. The short-run trade-off, the usual Phillips curve, depends on people not being completely rational, or else some wages and some prices in the economy being sticky. The long-run Phillips curve is vertical, and the short-run Phillips curve reflects a trade-off that centers around the underlying rate of inflation. If you drive the economy faster than the speed limit, you can get less unemployment at the cost of higher inflation. If you drive the economy slower, you get less inflation, but at the cost of more unemployment. If you look at a graph of the performance of the U.S. economy over time, it's easy to see what the business press is talking about when they characterize the economy as a roller coaster, the ups and downs of expansions and contractions. Now, in March of 2000, the U.S. economy entered its 110th month of continuous economic expansion. That is, we haven't had a recession in nearly a decade, and some economists are beginning to wonder if maybe the business cycle isn't history. Does it really still explain the way the economy works? Or are we not in some kind of new economy where we won't necessarily have another recession? In order to evaluate this claim, we need to understand two things. First, what do economists think about the way business cycles have worked in the past? And next, what may have changed in the environment that's rendered the business cycle obsolete? Let's think first about the way business cycles have worked in the past. Typically what happens is the economy starts growing, some technological change or new set of markets created by an international trade agreement, and everybody is gearing up to take advantage of the profit-making opportunities. Businesses are building new factories and stocking them with equipment. Consumers are spending on goods and services out of the wealth they're anticipating getting from the stock market or their paychecks, and the government maybe also is spending. So as everyone begins to spend, the economy grows. The multiplier effect. Income leads to more spending, leads to more income. And as business expands, businesses have to hire more labor and to procure more raw materials. Now, all the businesses during this boom are doing the same thing, which means eventually they start depleting the stocks of these productive resources and driving up their prices. That means unemployment gets so low that you've got to start bidding workers away from other companies, and wages begin to rise. Or lumber is in short supply, or oil is in short supply, something, and the price of those commodities begins to rise as well. And eventually these costs of production have to be passed on to your customers in the form of higher prices for goods and services. Then the Fed gets concerned that we're on the verge of inflation, so it takes away the punch bowl. That is, it tightens the money supply, jacks up the interest rate, and everyone gets scared, stops spending, and the economy tips into recession. So there you have it, the business cycle. A boom, the fear of inflation, the Fed acts, and we head into recession. That's the same old story that we've had for years and years and years in the U.S. economy. So what's different today that makes economists think that we're in some kind of new regime? Well, first of all, we have unemployment that is at an extremely low level, 4%, lower than what many people thought was the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Typically, by now, the Fed would have blown the whistle on this party. But what's happening is we see very, very little inflation anywhere in the economy. Part of that is due to rapid increases in labor productivity. As offices are stocked with computers, the workers are better trained, they have more tools to work with. The output per worker has been rising rapidly in the last few years. This means that businesses can afford to pay their workers higher wages without creating inflation, because the workers are actually producing more. Moreover, on the other side of the picture, businesses are afraid to raise their prices because of globalization and technology. Globalization means that you can always import the product that you're buying right now from some other city or some other country. There are all kinds of people out there producing automobiles and sweaters, and because you can buy from them, your local dealer is afraid to raise his or her price by too much. Technology plays a role in this too, because the internet gives you quick access to price quotes from other dealers around the country, and in some cases around the world. So the internet puts a lid on the price increases that your local dealer can enact, because if the prices get too high, you'll buy your products from some other state or country. So, the same thing's true with workers. I want to raise, but if I ask for too much of a wage increase and my cohort does the same thing, then my company will move its production to some other country where the wages are low and the productivity is rising. Globalization creates increased competition, and in an environment with increased competition, workers are afraid to ask for big wage increases, and companies are afraid to enact big price increases. This means that inflation is not especially strong a concern, so the Fed doesn't have to act to take away the punch bowl. That is, we've got low unemployment and the economy is booming. This is like the best possible Phillips Curve trade-off imaginable. Usually you think with unemployment this low, inflation would be raging. However, because of globalization and technology, inflation has remained low, so we've got kind of the best of both worlds. Maybe this is some kind of new economy. But we should be careful, because if we buy into this mythology, we might start making mistakes. First of all, if we think inflation is dead, then the Federal Reserve may start to get careless and pump in money to stimulate the economy and satisfy the voters and the housing industry and all those people who like low interest rates. And if they do that, then sure as you're born, we'll have inflation back before you know it. Because inflation is, in the end, also dependent on how tightly the money supply is regulated. Other things that we should be concerned about is making sure that we don't overregulate the economy so that innovation continues and productivity gains are secured and, in fact, advanced by new methods of doing things. We need to keep doing the same stuff that we've been doing for the past few years. An environment in which entrepreneurship is rewarded, in which prices are stable, in which the climate for business is good. In this case, we've got the best possible outcome. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that the business cycle is over. These productivity gains will eventually plateau and reach some new level, at which point they'll become stable. At that point, further increases in demand for labor are likely to push up wages, and when they do, inflation could become a fear again. There are always going to be shortages of labor and raw materials during periods of booms. Oil may be less important to our economy than it used to be. I mean, back in the 1970s and 1980s, an increase in the price of oil could lead to stagflation. Even during a period of unemployment, you could get prices rising because of the supply shock. Nowadays, oil is less important to our economy, but we've seen in recent months that higher prices for oil can lead consumers to change their behavior and can raise the cost of doing business. Just because it's less important doesn't mean it's irrelevant. The new economy is interesting because it's diversified, because it's characterized by rapid increases in productivity, and because globalization creates a very, very competitive environment. But at base, the same rules apply. If you try to run an engine too fast with a limited amount of gas, you're just going to crash somehow. If we try to push our economy too hard without skilled labor to man the jobs and enough resources getting to factories in time, then we're going to have rising costs and inflation. Those rules haven't changed. Right now, we're just really lucky, and we should keep doing the things we can to ensure that productivity and prosperity continues.
Videos, we've discussed how a country's equilibrium level of national output is determined by the level of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply at any given time. We examined situations in which countries had negative output gaps, otherwise known as recessionary gaps, and positive output gaps, also called inflationary gaps. You'll recall that the short run in macroeconomics is defined as the fixed wage period. It's the period of time over which, because of labor contracts and government interventions such as unemployment benefits and minimum wage laws, firms are unable to lower the wages that they pay their workers, and they're also able to hire more workers without having to raise wages. Because of wage inflexibility, In the short run, changes in the price level and the level of aggregate demand in the economy will lead to decreases in output when aggregate demand decreases, as we see in our graph on the left here. A fall in aggregate demand, also known as a negative demand shock, causes a short-run decrease in the equilibrium level of output from YFE, full employment national output, to Y1, and a decrease in the equilibrium price level from PLF, the full employment price level, to PL1. This decrease in output and the price level is the result of sticky or inflexible wages in the short run. If firms could adjust the wage rates that they paid their workers as the prices of the goods that they produced fell, then they would lower wages when prices fell and continue to produce the same amount of output. If, on the other hand, there were an increase in aggregate demand in the economy, a positive demand shock, as we see in the graph on the right, in the short run, firms find it attractive to increase their output and hire more workers because wages are relatively fixed and profitable to produce more output. So output increases from our full employment level of output of YFE to our new equilibrium level of output of Y1. Additionally, there is demand pull inflation, which we defined in our last video on aggregate demand and aggregate supply shocks, as the equilibrium price level in the economy goes from PLFE to PL1. So in these two graphs, we have illustrated a recessionary gap. We called this a recessionary gap, and an inflationary gap. Output is beyond full employment in the graph on the right. In the short run, inflationary gaps and recessionary gaps are possible because of wage inflexibility. The fact that firms must reduce their level of employment and output when demand for their products falls because they cannot lower the wages that they pay their workers. And the fact that firms will increase their level of output and employment in the short run when demand for their products rise because they can continue to hire more workers at the same inflexible wage rate that they were paying workers at the full employment level of output. So these are our short-run outcomes. Recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps are the likely outcome from demand and supply shocks in the short run due to inflexible wages. So let's now transition to the long run. What is the long run in macroeconomics? Well, the short run is defined as the fixed wage period. The long run is defined as the flexible wage period. It's the amount of time it takes for wages to fully adjust to the price level and the level of demand in the economy, and other costs of production, not just the wages for workers, but also the rents for land, the interest rates for capital, and any other costs that firms face. In the long run, we assume that wages and other costs of production paid by firms are fully flexible and will adjust to whatever the price level in the economy is. For this reason, output will always return and adjust to its full employment level because during periods of deflation and falling demand of the economy, costs of production will fall and a nation's economy will return to its full employment level of output. So let's walk through the scenario here following a negative demand shock and a recessionary gap. In the short run, aggregate demand falls due to, let's say, a decrease in consumption or a decrease in investment in the economy, one of those aggregate expenditures that we introduced in our first video on aggregate demand. Following a decrease in aggregate demand, firms are unable to lower the wages that they pay their workers. The economy experiences a recession. Equilibrium national output decreases to Y1. As a result of this, there is an increase in unemployment. You could say the unemployment rate increases. In the short run, unemployed workers will begin collecting benefits from the government. They'll start looking for new jobs for which they'll expect to get paid the same wage that they were getting paid before they lost their previous jobs. But what happens after 6 months, after a year, after 18 months? Unemployment benefits from the government eventually run out. Workers' expectations of receiving the same wage that they were being paid before begin to diminish, and workers will ultimately be willing to accept lower wages. And as they do, firms will find it once again attractive to hire more workers to increase their output. So we would expect to see short-run aggregate supply increase as the wage rate falls. Recall that wages and other resource costs are the major determinant of the level of aggregate supply in the economy. So as the wage rate falls, aggregate supply increases. Firms once again wish to hire more workers, despite the fact that demand for their products is lower and that the prices they can sell their products for has also fallen. Lower wages make it more attractive to produce output, and output should begin to recover and return to the full employment level. So we now have a new full employment price level. I'll call that PL full employment 1, and we have returned to our original full employment level of national output. In this way, the economy self-corrects from a demand-deficient recession. Following the decrease in aggregate demand in the short run, fixed wages require firms to lay workers off. But in the long run, wages are fully flexible, because the long run is defined as the flexible wage period. Reasons for flexible wages in the long run, let's just outline some here. Unemployment benefits end, workers' expectations diminish, and basically it sounds bad, but workers become more willing to accept lower wages. In a way, workers who are unemployed become somewhat desperate and they're willing to go back to work for lower wages. As they do, an economy could, theoretically, flexible wages should lead to further deflation, falling input costs, and a recovery in output from the recessionary level of Y1 to the full employment level of YFE. So let's illustrate what happens in the long run following an inflationary gap. Over in this graph, we had our inflationary gap following an increase in aggregate demand. Let's say that maybe net exports increased or government spending increased. That could cause our aggregate demand curve to shift out, cause a short run increase in the equilibrium level of output, and a short run increase in the price level as the economy experiences demand pull inflation. In the short run, recall that wages are relatively fixed. Other input costs are fixed as well. Firms are highly incentivized to increase their output because doing so increases their profits as the price level and the demand for their output rises. But in the long run, what will happen? In the long run, wages will increase, other costs will increase. The reason for this is that labor markets are extra tight during a period of inflation. The economy's output is beyond full employment. All resource prices start to rise because of rising demand for workers, land, capital, and any other factors of production that firms require to produce the increased level of output. So as wages and other costs rise in the long run, aggregate supply is going to shift inwards until the economy returns to its full employment level. So here's our short run aggregate supply in the long run. In the long run, because of rising wages, the wage rate increases, aggregate supply will decrease, and this economy will return to its full employment level of output. So we see the economy self-correct. This is called self-correction. Inflationary gaps will be corrected in the long run as wages adjust to the level of aggregate demand and prices in the economy. So we end up with a new full employment price level and the original full employment level of national income. This model that we've been using is called the long run self-correction model. In the long run, an economy will correct itself following recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps because of flexible wages. This assumes that wages are fully flexible in the long run. The only reason, according to this theory, that negative and positive output gaps can occur in the short run is because of the inflexibility of wages. Now, this might have policy implications for government policymakers. If a government of a country experiencing a recession believes in this long-run self-correction viewpoint, then anything the government can do to make wages more flexible would help the economy recover more quickly. For example, reducing the period of time during which unemployed workers can receive benefits from the government, reducing minimum wages, reducing labor union power. Policies that promote self-correction of the economy are sometimes called supply-side policies. We're going to talk about these later in the course. Supply-side policies are any policies meant to increase aggregate supply and help an economy achieve short-run or long-run economic growth. All right, guys, in this video, we introduced the definition of long run in macroeconomics. This is the period of time over which wages and all other costs of production are fully flexible and will adjust to the price level in the economy. Because wages and other costs will adjust in the long run, output will always return to its full employment level in the long run. This now explains why the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical at the full employment level of output. No matter how much demand, no matter how much inflation or deflation there is in the economy, in the long run, output will always return to its full employment level because wages will always adjust to whatever the price level and the level of demand is.
the minimum wage. A national minimum wage which sets the minimum hourly legal wage rate was introduced into the UK in 1999. Its aim was to reduce poverty pay. Low pay can result from a number of labour market failures, including a lack of access to the labour market as a result of barriers to entry, such as discrimination. Also, where markets are dominated by a single employer, a monopsonist, average wages may be below the competitive market rate, with individuals unable to bargain for wage increases. Low pay can also result from inward migration from low-pay countries, which drives down the wages for domestic employees. Low pay often reflects a lack of skills and a very elastic demand for labour, as firms have a large pool of workers to choose from. There are several potential benefits of a minimum wage. Firstly, greater equality can be achieved, and the distribution of income between the high-paid and the low-paid may be narrowed. Poverty may be reduced as the low-paid gain more income, and the unemployed may be encouraged to join the labour market. Exploitation by powerful monopsonists may also be restricted. A minimum wage can also save government spending in terms of having to pay lower benefits and tax credits. Finally, a higher minimum wage provides a boost to earnings which can increase national income and create jobs. A country's official level of development may also increase. However, the classical free market argument against the national minimum wage is that it can create unemployment by distorting labour markets. Assuming the minimum wage is higher than market clearing wage, demand will contract and supply extend. The contraction of demand is the result of a combined income and substitution effect in the response to the higher wage rate. For example, a minimum wage of £10 an hour would create a contraction in demand to E1, but supply would extend to E2 as more low-skilled workers are encouraged to look for work, creating classical unemployment of E1 to E2. In addition, critics argue that a higher minimum wage can cause price inflation as firms pass on the higher wages in higher prices. The competitiveness of goods abroad can also suffer compared with low-wage economies, such as China and India. This can worsen the balance of payments. Similarly, inward investment may be deterred, as foreign investors will look to avoid high-wage economies. The labour market may also become inflexible in response to changes in the rest of the economy. Finally, workers and employers may be driven into the unofficial labour market. The full impact of a minimum wage depends upon the level of the minimum wage and the elasticity of demand for and supply of labour. By 2015, the adult rate had risen to £6.70 per hour, and the rate for 18 to 21-year-olds to £5.30. In recent years, the idea of a voluntary living wage has received wide support from politicians and employers. To see more videos, go to www.
Final part of this series is concerned with the Phillips curve. The short-run Phillips curve is the relationship between unemployment and inflation when the expected inflation rate and the natural unemployment rate are both held constant. It suggests that in the short run there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. The cost of maintaining low unemployment is high inflation, and the cost of maintaining low inflation is high unemployment. This is important to consider when authorities make decisions about how to deal with inflation or unemployment, as they must consider the other as well. The long-run Phillips curve is the relationship between inflation and unemployment when the actual inflation rate is equal to the expected inflation rate. It is vertical at the natural unemployment rate because in the long run, any expected inflation rate is possible. The curve being vertical implies that there is no relationship at all between the inflation rate and unemployment rate. A change in the expected inflation rate will shift the short-run Phillips curve and only the short-run Phillips curve. The intersection of the long-run and short-run Phillips curves indicates the expected rate of inflation. If the expected inflation rate increases, the short-run Phillips curve shifts upward, and if it decreases, then the short-run Phillips curve shifts downward. A change in the natural unemployment rate will shift both the long-run and short-run Phillips curves. An increase in the natural unemployment rate will shift both curves outward, and a decrease in the natural unemployment rate will shift both curves to the left. In both cases, the expected inflation rate does not change, and thus there is no vertical movement of the short-run Phillips curve. The movement is only horizontal. That was the series on business cycle theory.
Hello class. Today we're going to work on chapter 28. It's a relatively short chapter and basically explains unemployment and how we measure the unemployment rate. So we're going to see how is unemployment measured, what is the natural rate of unemployment, and why are there always some people unemployed. We're going to look at a little bit how unemployment is affected by unions and minimum wage, and we're going to see the idea about the theory of efficiency wages. So every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is run by the US Department of Labor, sends out a survey. And it surveys about 60,000 households in the US. And what they do is that they basically ask in that survey, to anyone who's above the age of 16 or older, whether they're working or if they're not working, what are they doing? Are they looking for a job or are they not looking for a job? So after the survey comes in, and this is done every month, the BLS divides the population into three groups. The first group is employed. These are people who are either they're working, they're paid employees, or they're self-employed, or they are unpaid workers in a family business. The second group is unemployed workers, people who are not working, but they have been looking for a job for the past 4 weeks. So this is an important number, 4 weeks. That's the cutoff point. If someone looked for a job 6 weeks ago, then that person is not considered unemployed. But if someone is looking for a job for the past 4 weeks, then they're considered to be unemployed. And everyone else is considered, if you're not employed or not unemployed, then you're not in the labor force. So the labor force in the US is the total number of workers, which is the sum of employed and unemployed workers. So the unemployment rate is calculated in the following way. It is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. So that's the formula for unemployment rate. And the labor force participation rate is the percentage of adults that are in the labor force. So out of the total number of adults in the labor force, or a total number of adults in the US, how many are in the labor force? So let's look at an example. So let's say this is the information we have. The number of employed people in the US is 144.3 million. The number of unemployed is 11.3 million. And the rest of the people not in the labor force is 90.6 million. So not in the labor force, this includes people who are full-time students who are not working or who are above the age of 65 and they retired, stay-at-home moms, stay-at-home dads. All those people are not considered to be part of the labor force. So now if we wanted to compute the labor force, unemployment rate, adult population, and labor force participation rate using this data, so the labor force is the total number of people employed plus total number of people unemployed, which is 155.6 million. The unemployment rate is out of the proportion of people in the labor force, what is the percentage of people who are currently not working and are looking for a job? So it's 11.3 million out of this 155.6 million, so it's about 7.3%. The total population of adults is the total number of people in the labor force and the total number of people not in the labor force, which is 246 million. And so the labor force participation rate is the proportion of adults who are either working or are looking for a job. And so from this number, we find that it's about 63%. So out of the total number of adults in the US, 63% of the adults either work or are looking for a job. So if we look at the BLS, not only does look at total labor force statistics, they actually disaggregate it by different groups, by states, by cities, so you can have an understanding of what groups have different levels of unemployment rate or different levels of labor force participation. And these data reveal very different labor market experiences for different groups. So if we look at adults who are 20 years and older, if we look at a white male, the unemployment rate is 6.1%, labor force participation rate is 72%. Okay, let's say for an African American female, the unemployment rate is 10% and the labor force participation rate is 61%. If we look at teens, people between the ages of 16 and 19, the unemployment rate is much higher and the labor force participation rate is also much lower because most teens in that age group are full-time students. If you look at people from other ethnic groups, Asians have an unemployment rate of 5.3%, whereas Hispanics have an unemployment rate of 9%. If we look at by education, we see people with less than high school degree have a high unemployment rate. People with a bachelor's degree or more have a very low unemployment rate. And if we look at labor force participation rate, of course, it increases as people have more degrees or have more education. This is how labor force participation rate has changed over time. For women, it has increased from 1960s till about 1995, and then it's kind of stabilized, and we have been seeing that it's falling over time. Same thing we see with males. Males have also, the labor force participation rate has been falling over time. So less people as a proportion are actually working or are looking for a job. What does unemployment rate actually measure? I mean, it's not a perfect indicator of joblessness because it excludes discouraged workers. If a worker has been looking for a job for weeks and weeks and weeks and finally gave up, the unemployment rate does not measure those people because they are considered to be out of the labor force. It doesn't distinguish between full-time and part-time jobs. So it doesn't distinguish between the quality of jobs that people have. So you might have people who are working part-time because they can't get a full-time job because it's unavailable. Unemployment rate does not measure that. It just measures whether you're employed or unemployed. Sometimes people misreport their work status, but even after all those issues, the unemployment rate is still a very important barometer to measure the labor market. It becomes a very important issue during elections. If unemployment rate is very high, then politicians make it a big issue that, look, this is not how the economy should not be run. What's the duration? Most unemployment spells are short. Typically, 1/3 of the people are unemployed for under 5 weeks. 2/3 are unemployed for under 14 weeks. So if 100 people lose their job today, 33 of them will get a job within 5 weeks, and about 67 of them will get a job within 14 weeks, which is about 3.5 months. About 20 of them will be unemployed for over 6 months. Yet most observed unemployment is long run. This is the group of people who have very little turnover. So these are the people whom we see as unemployed for most periods of time. And so identifying who is long-term unemployed and why they are long-term unemployed can help policymakers design policies that can help those people who are unemployed for long periods of time. Now, there is always some unemployment because and the reason is because of what we call frictional unemployment, and we're going to see that. The natural rate of unemployment is basically the rate at which the economy performs the best. So even if the economy is growing at tremendous speed, the economy is wealthy, there is still some degree of unemployment, and that's called the natural rate of unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is any deviation from the natural rate of unemployment. And this is associated with business cycles, and we will try to cover a little bit in chapters 30. If not, then you can learn it if you want to take more econ courses. So if we look at this, this is how the kind of US unemployment rate looks like over time. There are periods when it was very high. That's the natural rate. So basically, let's say in 1980, let's look at a pointer. The natural unemployment rate is supposed to be around 7%, so the economy would have been great, performing very strong if the natural rate of unemployment has been around 7%. But the observed unemployment was around 10.5 or 11%. So this deviation, this is known as cyclical unemployment. So any deviation from the natural rate is called cyclical unemployment. Now, why do we see that the economy is still has some unemployment even when there is like if the economy is doing really well? And the reason is because of what we call frictional unemployment. This happens when workers spend time searching for the job that best suits their skills and taste. So for example, let's say you're a senior in college right now, and then you want to graduate and in May, but you're not taking any jobs. You applied to a lot of jobs, you got an offer, but it's not the one that you want. So you're waiting, and you want to wait and see if you get the job that you really want. So, in effect, you are unemployed, you're looking for a job, but you're confident that you will get a better job. And this is short-term for most workers. The other kind is structural. This is when there are fewer jobs than workers. So there's fewer jobs to go around, and there are more workers. And this is usually longer term. And this is when people don't have maybe the right set of skills in the job market. So workers have different tastes and skills, and sometimes jobs have different requirements. And so job search is a way of matching workers with appropriate jobs. And there are things that we call sectoral shifts, which causes changes in the composition of the economy. So for example, North Carolina was a big clothing manufacturer back in the day, but then because of changes in the economy, that industry no longer exists in North Carolina. So a lot of people who were working in that industry became unemployed. So the economy, that kind of shifts, they displace workers, and now they must search for new jobs that fits their skills and tastes. And so the economy is always changing, so frictional unemployment is always there, and so you must do certain things to keep yourself, probably train or acquire new skill sets so that you get jobs. And so there's always going to be some frictional unemployment because of that. The industry where you're working may disappear, and so you must find another job somewhere else. How does government help reduce unemployment rate? Well, there are government employment agencies that provide information to job vacancies, and they help to match workers with jobs. There are public training programs that aim to equip workers from declining industries to other industries where there is a need for people. And there's unemployment insurance, which is a program that provides some money. If someone loses their jobs, then unemployment insurance provides some income to workers when they become unemployed for a specific number of time, usually around 26 weeks. Unemployment insurance does increase frictional unemployment in a way because unemployment insurance ends when a worker takes a job. So if a worker just lost their job, they may not search for a job right away. They might wait for, let's say, up till the week 20. They're getting some income. It's not their full income, but about 60% of it could be at most 60% of their wages. So why would you lose that opportunity? So what they do, what a lot of workers, not all of them, but of some workers, they might have less incentive to search really hard to find a job until when the deadline approaches of them losing their unemployment insurance. So that's when they're like, okay, now I got to find a job, and now I got to make sure that, because I'm going to run out of this money soon, so I must look for a job now. The benefits are it reduces uncertainty over income. So if you lose your income or if you lose your job, you don't fall into poverty right away. It gives people more time to search for a job that better suits their taste and their skills. But it also may be misused by some people. They might just wait until the last minute to find a job and get the benefits of unemployment insurance. Now there's another kind called structural unemployment. Structural unemployment happens if this is the demand for labor workers, that's the supply of workers. If that's the wage, it normally happens if there's not enough jobs to go around. And this normally happens when the wage is kept above equilibrium. So even though the equilibrium wage is WE, for some reason wage is actually kept at W1. So we have some degree of unemployment like that. So there is more workers who are willing to work, less workers, less demand for workers, and so there is unemployment there. So there are three reasons for this. One is minimum wage, and we talked about this in chapter 6. Minimum wage may keep some workers from not working because there is not enough demand for their work. But this group is small part of the labor force. It's not. Yes, it is important to the people who work at minimum wage, but as part of the whole labor force, the proportion of people who work at minimum wage is relatively small, so it can't explain most unemployment. Unions do affect it. Union is a worker association that bargains with employers over wages, benefits, and working conditions. So unions also exert market power and negotiate wages on behalf of workers. And it is usually a typical union worker earns about 20% higher wages than a non-union worker. So because of bargaining, because unions bring workers together and they work together, if one worker goes up to the firm and says, I want more wages, then the firm might say, no, I can't pay you more. If you don't like it, you can leave. But if all the workers band together and go to the firm or the owner and say, we want higher wages, the firm cannot fire all of them because recruiting all those workers it can take a long time. It can be a very costly process. So firms might ask for, okay, well, all right, we're going to pay you more, just stay. So it can raise wages of union workers, and that can have an effect on non-union worker in finding unemployment, because even if I want to work in that industry, if it's unionized, then I can't because I'm not, because the demand for my work is less, or there is no demand for my work. The third is efficiency wages, which is basically firms pay higher wages to workers to boost their productivity. There are different versions why, this happens. Why would a firm actually want to pay more? Well, the reason is one is worker health. If you're paid more, you tend to eat better quality food, so your health gets better. Worker turnover decreases because if you're already paid a high amount, why would you want to leave? You want to stay in this, with that employer as long as possible. Worker quality is higher. If I get paid more, I get to work more. I'm more productive because I don't want to lose this job. And worker effort is also more because, since I don't want to lose the job, I am going to work as hard as possible to make sure that the boss knows that I'm working hard. So these are some theories why wages are kept above equilibrium wage, and that's why we see some degree of structural unemployment. Right, so that's all we have for our unemployment chapter.
We're going to be looking closely at unemployment. We're going to define unemployment, look at the different types of unemployment a country's economy might experience, talk about the formula for calculating the unemployment rate, identify some of the causes, do a graphical analysis using an ADAS model, and finally we'll outline some of the solutions to the different types of unemployment that might exist. Let's start with the definition of unemployment. Now, if you're studying macroeconomics, you've probably learned that keeping the nation's unemployment rate low is one of the major macroeconomic objectives of government policymakers. But what exactly is unemployment? Unemployment refers to the condition of a worker being out of work, looking for a job, but unable to find a job. So that's a very specific definition. Not having a job is different than being unemployed. Many people who do not have jobs in a country are not unemployed. For example, young people who aren't of working age, old people who are retired and no longer part of the labor force, or students who are in school or university, getting an education and not actively looking for a job. So to be considered unemployed, somebody must be actively looking for a job but unable to find one. That's the definition of unemployment. Now, to get more detailed, we have to break down the different types of unemployment that a country's economy might experience. Let's start with one called frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is a very common type of unemployment that refers to a situation in which a worker is in between jobs, or a student has graduated or finished school and is looking for his or her first job. Frictional unemployment is a very natural type of unemployment. Every economy will be experiencing some degree of frictional unemployment at all times. It's also a sign that an economy is perhaps even healthy. Having frictional unemployment indicates that workers are confident enough to leave a job and look for a new job. It also indicates that students are graduating from universities or schools and looking for their first jobs. So frictional unemployment is going to be included in what we call the natural rate of unemployment, which we will talk about a little bit later. A second type of unemployment that exists in every nation's economy is structural unemployment. This is unemployment arising from changes in the structure of a nation's output. Now, clearly we need some more information to get a good idea of what this is really referring to. For example, as the output shifts from primary commodities to secondary or on to tertiary, which refers to services, the need for different types of labor changes. Structural unemployment is also what we consider a natural or normal type of unemployment. Every country should be experiencing structural unemployment at all times, and it's not necessarily a sign of a sick or weak economy. Structural unemployment could be a sign that technological change and globalization are actually driving economic growth in a country. The third type of unemployment is called cyclical. This is the least desirable and the most harmful type of unemployment that a country could experience. We refer to cyclical unemployment as demand deficient unemployment. In other words, this is the unemployment that arises from a fall in aggregate demand. In other words, when an economy is in a recession, cyclical unemployment exists. Clearly, the words recession and demand deficient imply that an economy is not doing well. We'll graph the different types of unemployment using an ADS model in just a moment, but first let's talk about the formula. Usually when discussing unemployment, we refer to the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate refers to the proportion of the total labor force that is unemployed at any given time. So we're going to write out a simple equation here. The unemployment rate is measured by measuring the number of unemployed people in an economy using the definition above, workers who are out of work, looking for a job and unable to find a job, divided by the number of people in what we call the total labor force, or the TLF. The total labor force. This includes everybody in a nation above the age of 16 who is either employed or unemployed. In other words, people who are looking for a job, unable to find one, or already have a job. The total labor force does not include people who are not looking for jobs. In other words, university students, older high school students, individuals who are not actively looking for jobs or not actually employed or not part of the labor force. So once we divide the number of unemployed by the number in the total labor force, we multiply this by 100, and that gives us the unemployment rate, or the percentage of the total labor force that is at any given time unemployed. Before we do our graphical analysis, let's talk about some of the causes of frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment. Now, as I already explained above, frictional unemployment exists when people are in between jobs, or when people are leaving school and looking for their first jobs. So why might the level of frictional unemployment be higher in some countries than in others? Well, this really has to do with labor market rigidities. What do we mean by this? How hard is it for people who are looking for new jobs to find new jobs? In other words, if there is easy access to information about employment, then the frictional unemployment should be lower. If people are able to move around a country and move to different places where jobs exist, then frictional unemployment will be lower. However, if there are rigidities in the labor market or obstacles to people finding information about where jobs exist, or the ability to move to different places in the country in order to take those jobs, then we would expect frictional unemployment to be a little bit higher. So what are the causes of structural unemployment? Technological change that makes certain types of labor redundant. For example, robots come into a factory and replace factory workers. Technological change can cause structural unemployment, and globalization is the second major cause of structural unemployment. As more and more goods are produced in low-wage countries such as China, around Southeast Asia, or Latin America, workers in the industries that are no longer producing those goods in the rich world will become structurally unemployed. Now, you may say that that's a terrible thing, that structural unemployment is a bad thing because those workers have little hope of finding new jobs. And on a personal, individual level, there's no doubt that structural unemployment is undesirable. But overall, do technological change and globalization indicate improvements or deterioration in a country's economic situation? I think it's pretty clear that both of the causes of structural unemployment are generally good for a nation's economy as a whole. So we can conclude that structural unemployment, while difficult for those who are experiencing it, is not necessarily a sign of a sick or unhealthy economy. Referring to cyclical unemployment, we already indicated that cyclical unemployment arises from a fall in aggregate demand. Hence the other name for this type of unemployment, demand deficient unemployment. This could also be caused by a recession. So the third type of unemployment, cyclical, is clearly the least desirable. It is a sign of a nation's economy being very sick, and there is a level of demand for the nation's goods that is below the full employment level. Individuals who would normally be employed in a nation's economy, if it were producing at full employment, are unable to find jobs when there is cyclical unemployment. Hence, it is the least desirable type of unemployment in a nation. Here we're going to talk about the natural rate of unemployment. Before watching this, you should have already learned the different types of unemployment that a country could experience. To review, there are three types of unemployment that an individual could experience or that a country could experience. The first is structural. Structural is the unemployment resulting from changes in technology or the composition of a nation's output. The second type of unemployment that an individual or a country could experience is frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is perhaps the easiest to understand because most of you will experience frictional unemployment before any other type. It's the type of unemployment experienced when an individual is in between jobs or looking for his or her first job. Frictional unemployment is what you will experience when you enter the labor market for the first time after graduating high school or university. When you're in that transition stage and applying for your first job, you will be temporarily frictionally unemployed. Finally, there's cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is that which results from fluctuations in a country's business cycle. During periods of recession, cyclical unemployment will increase. During periods of expansion, cyclical unemployment will decrease or even become negative if a country is producing beyond its full employment level. Now that we have defined the three types of unemployment, we're going to talk about which of these are considered natural or normal unemployment that an economy will experience even when it's producing at its full employment level. Now this sounds a little counterintuitive. You'd think if a country is at full employment, there would be zero unemployment, but that is simply not the case. Even when an economy is doing as well as it can hope to do, when all resources are being used efficiently and the country is producing at its potential level of output, there will be some unemployment in the economy. And the types of unemployment that will exist are structural and frictional. These types of unemployment are normal, and in economics terms, we actually call them natural. So we could say that cyclical unemployment is not natural. The existence of cyclical unemployment is evidence that a country is producing below its full employment level and experiencing a recession or a contraction in its business cycle. Output has fallen below the full employment level. Now, to help us better understand this, we're going to look at some real unemployment data for the United States of America. Notice the dates here. We have data going back to 1990 all the way up to 2018. 28 years of unemployment data here. Let's look at some trends. Notice that over the 28-year span, unemployment fluctuated, not surprisingly, along with the business cycle. In years when unemployment was increasing in the early 1990s, in the early 2000s, and in the late 2000s, before 2009, these were periods of recession in America's business cycle. And the increase in unemployment during these periods was the result of rising cyclical unemployment. So we can say that during these periods, cyclical unemployment was increasing. Cyclical unemployment increases when there is a decrease in output in a nation in a period of time, usually resulting from a decrease in total demand for the nation's goods and services. During these periods, we had an increase in cyclical unemployment. So what we want to try to determine next is what might America's natural rate of unemployment be? In other words, what unemployment would prevail when America is producing at its full employment level, not experiencing recession, and it's also not experiencing or approaching a peak in its business cycle. And we can pretty much discern what that rate would be. It could be considered the rate of unemployment that the country tends to return to after recessions. So notice that somewhere between 5 and 6%, we could estimate America's natural rate of unemployment might have existed during the 1990s and the 2000s. If I had to draw a trend line through this blue unemployment line, it would probably look something like this. In other words, what's the average unemployment rate over all these years? It tended to fluctuate around 6 and 5%. Of course, during the recession of 2008-2009, it rose dramatically and then fell again to its current low of just around 4.1%. So studying this data, what could we say America's natural rate of unemployment is? It looks like it's probably between 4.5% and 5.5%. This is the unemployment rate that would prevail in the United States when the economy is producing at its full employment level. Of course, there are periods of rising cyclical unemployment which pull that unemployment rate up, and there are periods when the economy was approaching peaks in its business cycle right before these recessions. For example, in 2001, unemployment was down around 4%. In 2007, unemployment was around 4.4%. And today, in 2018, unemployment once again is back around 4%. So you may wonder, well, does this mean America's at a peak in its business cycle and might enter a recession? Well, a lot of people are asking that same question because looking at historical trends, we might expect to see unemployment rise again in the near future. The natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate that prevails when an economy is producing at its full employment level of output. The two types of unemployment included in a country's natural rate are structural and frictional. These are normal, natural types of unemployment that even a healthy economy producing its potential output would expect to experience.
The other part of our classical model is the labor market. The labor market is going to look at the interaction of labor demand and labor supply, and it's going to tell us what the price is and what the quantity is, just like any other market. Now the trick is, when we're looking at the labor market, things are a little backwards from what we're used to. So let's look at labor demand first. Normally we think of demanders as ourselves. We buy goods and services. In this market, though, the demanders of labor are businesses that want to hire people. So we have the quantity is how much labor is being hired. The price is the real wage per hour, and it follows the law of demand. As wages go down, businesses want to hire more workers, so the labor demand curve is downward sloping. Anything which affects how much labor businesses want to hire is going to affect labor demand. If it's the wage rate, it's going to be a shift along the labor demand curve. If it's anything else, say the demand for goods and services being produced, it's going to be a shift of the labor demand curve. The other part of the market is labor supply. Now this is us. We supply labor to the market. Workers do. And when we look at real wages, an increase in real wages increases the number of workers that are willing to work, and so the labor supply curve is upward sloping. Anything else that affects the amount of work people want to supply, say cost of childcare, cost of transportation to your work, the taste for leisure, something like that, is going to shift the labor supply curve, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. You put the two together, you have labor demand, labor supply, you get equilibrium, and in this picture we'll have equilibrium at a price of $15 and labor of 7,500 units being supplied. Now what does that mean when we look at the long run? Well, again, in the long run we said that wages and prices are flexible enough to always get to equilibrium. So we have a labor demand curve, we have a labor supply curve, we're always going to be at equilibrium. We would not find ourselves in a situation where the wage rate was too high, because this would be an excess supply of labor. Under those circumstances, we would expect wages to fall, and we'd get to equilibrium. We also wouldn't expect to see ourselves in a position where wages too low. Here you'd have an excess demand for labor, wages are going to rise. So our assumption for classical models that wages and prices fluctuate get us to equilibrium in the labor market. What about changes in labor demand and labor supply? Well, suppose something happens that increases labor demand. Just like any other market, you're going to go from one equilibrium to the next. An increase in demand increases the price. In this instance, it increases real wages, and it increases the quantity. Here we're going to have more people working. Labor supply, if there's an increase in labor supply, it's just like any other market. An increase in supply decreases the price and increases the quantity. Here we would see a drop in wages and an increase in the quantity of labor. Now let's use our full employment model to answer some questions. For example, what happens if we have taxes? What happens to potential output? Now let's suppose we're going to institute something called a labor tax. Right? And that tax is going to be a tax paid by firms when they hire labor. Now what we would expect to happen is, since the cost of labor is rising, we're going to have a decrease in labor demand. And we'd go from an equilibrium at point A down to point B with less labor being used. How does that affect potential output? Well, let's roughly sort of draw in our production function up here on the above our labor market. And we can see that as the amount of labor goes down, so does potential output. And if we shifted from point A to point B, we could trace up to the production function how much potential output is, and we'd see that it goes down when the amount of labor goes down. So anything which decreases labor at equilibrium in the labor market is going to decrease potential output. Now we might talk about under what circumstances this happens. Some studies show that labor supply is inelastic, or it's vertical. If that's the case, then a shift of labor demand back doesn't change the amount of labor being used. It does, and thus it doesn't change employment, and thus it doesn't change potential output. So depending on how we think the labor market works and how labor supply, how elastic it is to changes in wages, we're going to have different effects on potential output. In most instances, when we look at these models, we're going to look at an upward sloping or somewhat elastic labor supply curve, and we would see an effect on potential output. Another way this model is used is in a theory called real business cycle theory. Real business cycle theorists believe that economic fluctuations or changes in output can be explained by using the long-run classical model. How would we explain a drop in output during a recession? Well, it would have been changes in the labor market which decreased employment. That would translate into drops in potential output. So real business cycle theory is the economic theory that emphasizes how shocks to the economy, to technology, cause fluctuations in economic activity. Suppose there's a negative technology shock and labor becomes less productive. That's going to shift the labor demand curve back, decreasing employment, and thus we'd see a drop in output. This is just one theory about how economic fluctuations happen. We're going to see more theories as we move forward and when we look at our short-run economic models. Now let's put the labor market and the production function together to get our full model of long-run output and our full classical model. Here we've got our production function, which tells us, given an amount of labor, how much output is going to be produced, and we can see that it goes up, but it goes up at a decreasing rate. In the bottom part of this graph, we've got the labor market, where we have labor supply and labor demand. So our question we ask in our production function is, given an amount of labor, how much output will we produce? So if we want to know how much output is being produced, we need to know how much labor is being used. That's told to us by the labor market. At equilibrium in the labor market, we know real wages are going to be equal to W, and the amount of labor being used is L. Now when we stack these two graphs on top of each other, we can do this because the same variable is on the horizontal axis. So if the labor market is telling us at equilibrium we're going to use L units of labor, that same amount of labor is the input to the production function, and that tells us how much output is being produced. This level of output is called the full employment level of output. How much output is produced when the labor market is in equilibrium. That's called the full employment level of output. We also call it potential output. Now let's use this model to answer some questions. We'll do that in our next section. Now we're going to start learning about some models. Models are a way economists try to describe how the economy works so that we can answer questions. The first set of models we're going to look at are long-run models, or what are called classical models. These are economic models that assume that wages and prices adjust freely to changes in demand and supply. Another way to think about that is to say that markets always get to equilibrium, right? That we don't have an excess demand or supply in any markets. And then the key market that we are going to look at when we look at long-run classical models is the labor market. So our working assumption is going to be that wages and prices adjust freely, so we're always at equilibrium. And when we look at the long-run model, we're going to see we're at equilibrium in the labor market, and this becomes a very powerful model for answering questions about long-run economic behavior. When we look at how much we can produce, or what's called potential output, or how fast output grows. So let's look at how we build up our classical model. Another interesting feature we get when we look at long-run models is something called crowding out. And if we look at how we divide output among different demands for GDP at full employment. So remember, when we looked at total GDP, we were able to figure out who was buying it. This was the expenditures approach for adding up GDP. And we had GDP, or output, was consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. Now let's look at a closed economy first, where we have no net exports. So in a closed economy, it's an economy without international trade. We would say that output is C plus I plus G. Now, we just looked at our long-run models, and we know that output is going to be equal to potential output because we're at equilibrium in our labor market. So if we have a change in something on the right-hand side of this equation, and there's no change on the left-hand side, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to have not an equal sign anymore. So suppose we thought that government expenditures went up. Well, if there's no change in potential output, then Y, or output, is not going to change. If that's the case, and government expenditures rises, well, we must have a drop in the other things that make up output in order to make it still the same level of output. This is called crowding out. It's a reduction in investment or some other component of GDP caused by an increase in government spending. And the reason this happens is because output in the long run, or in our classical model, is fixed at full employment. So when we get an increase in one component of output, the other components must fall. Generally, when we talk about crowding out, we're talking about a drop in investment. Has this happened? Certainly it has. Right? So when we look at World War II, during World War II, the share of government spending in GDP rose precipitously because we were spending a lot of money fighting World War II. And what did we see happen to the other parts of GDP? Well, the share of consumption in GDP went down. The same is true for the share of investment. Government expenditure share of GDP went up. The share of investments of GDP went down. This is also true in an open economy. And an open economy is one economy with international trade, and now we have GDP is C plus I plus G plus NX, or consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. If we have an increase in government expenditures, we could see a decrease in consumption or investment or net exports. And so an increase in government expenditures doesn't have to crowd out consumption and investment. It might crowd out net exports instead.